Hey guys, Kirk Herbstreit presents a chaotic scenario that could knock Alabama out of the playoffs. Would that be a scandal for Abama? These are just probabilities, okay? Let's go. Kirk Herbstreit's projection of a possible chaotic scenario in the college football playoff has ignited a debate that inevitably involves Tuscaloosa. At first glance, Alabama seems to be heading relatively smoothly towards a spot among the top 12, regardless of what happens in the SEC championship. But the ESPN commentator's analysis makes it clear there's an extreme scenario, improbable, but mathematically possible, in which the Crimson Tide would be pushed out of the competition. And when Herbstreit puts this scenario on the table, he does so by describing a combination of factors that, while far from practical reality, serve as a reminder of how complex this new CFP format still is, even for a giant like Alabama. During the nonstop program, Herbstreit detailed what this perfect storm would entail. It all begins with the results and rankings that the committee would release tonight. From there, the equation becomes almost an exercise in sports probability, where each piece needs to move in the exact direction for the catastrophe to occur. The central point is simple. A Duke victory over Virginia in the ACC championship, coupled with a BYU victory over Texas Tech in the Big 12 final, would rearrange the board in such a way that only one overall spot would remain to be contested. Considering this extreme scenario, and also assuming a possible defeat of Alabama by Georgia, the Tide would enter a race for space with teams that, mathematically, could have a momentary advantage, not necessarily superior sporting merit, but an advantage in the puzzle of automatic and overall spots. Herbstreit attempted to unravel this plot, always reinforcing that everything depends on a series of improbable results. He pointed out that Duke's victory would create space for two teams from the group of 5 to automatically enter the CFP. The American Championship winner and James Madison, currently the favorite in the Sun Belt. Thus, the ACC would be restricted to a single hope, Miami, which would then move into the same overall playoff pool that includes Alabama. When it comes to the mathematics applied to college football, things always get more nebulous. Herbstreit went a step further and also considered the impact of the Big Ten's automatic playoff berths, possibly placing 3 teams in the postseason, something that, although rare, cannot be completely ruled out with the current format. In this scenario, the Big 12 would also guarantee 2 representatives, since, even with an eventual loss to BYU, Texas Tech would remain in. And that's precisely what pushes Alabama to the edge of the list. The SEC, in turn, would have Georgia as champion. Texas A&M and Ole Miss would be virtually qualified for the overall playoff berths. If Alabama were to arrive at Sunday with a loss in Atlanta, and the committee were bound by this extremely rigid math, the SEC could indeed end up with only 3 representatives. And it is at this point in the discussion that Herbstreit's logic suggests that Alabama could be one of those harmed. What is striking is that Herbstreit doesn't make this analysis out of provocation or distrust in the work of Kalen DeBoer and his team. On the contrary, his statement makes it clear how chaotic and artificial this scenario seems. But at the same time, he points out that in a sport where unexpected results arise weekly, it would be naive to ignore the possibility, however small. Herbstreit summarizes all this as an almost theoretical projection, an exercise in futurology that would only take shape if Duke, BYU, Miami, and so many other accidental protagonists decided to defy the logic of favoritism. He himself acknowledges that he wouldn't want to be in the committee room if this improbable combination of results were confirmed. And with an uncomfortable smile, he adds, it would be chaos. But here's the essential point hanging over Tuscaloosa. Alabama doesn't control what happens in the other conferences, but it does control its performance on the field. And in that respect, The Crimson Tide arrives at the SEC championship with a coach who doesn't shy away from responsibility. Kalen DeBoer knows his team has been playing at a high level, that it has an identity, that it has the talent to face Georgia again. Regardless of the outcome of Georgia and Alabama, it's just a possibility we need to reflect on. Let's move forward. Paul Feinbaum isn't known for mincing words, but this time his indignation found a very specific target. The mere possibility of Alabama being eliminated from the playoffs after the SEC championship. For him, if the Crimson Tide, one of the most consistent teams of the season, led by a coach who restored identity, discipline, and competitiveness to the program, is eliminated after a loss to Georgia, then something bigger than a playoff spot is at stake. According to Feinbaum, this would be almost an attack against logic and the very spirit of college football. During his appearance on the program Get Up, Feinbaum categorically stated that excluding Alabama after a potential loss would jeopardize the entire model built around the conference finals. Events that generate billions of dollars and define entire narratives within the season. And what most irritated the commentator was the idea that the committee could use a cold, decontextualized analysis of the fourth quarter performance against Georgia to justify an elimination. He ironically described a room filled with elitist decisions, where the committee members, in his words, sitting with their caviar and Dom Perignon, could simply ignore the fact that Alabama defeated Georgia in the regular season, and not just any field, but on rival territory. For Feinbaum, nothing would be more illogical than punishing a team for reaching the final of the strongest conference in the country and still being treated as guilty for playing a high-level duel against an equally powerful opponent. This frustration gained even more strength because, objectively, Kalen DeBoer's Alabama had built a solid enough record to remain among the best teams in the country, even in case of a stumble in the final. When questioned about the possibility of Alabama being penalized after a loss in Atlanta, DeBoer presented arguments that go far beyond slogans or emotional appeals. He spoke about facts. With composure but firmness, DeBoer reiterated that Alabama arrives at the SEC championship game with a 7-1 record within the conference, having won 4 games on the road in historically hostile environments against rivals who tend to turn each game into a battlefield. He also spoke of the team's 10-game winning streak in the last 11 games, a feat that any program in the country would consider a sign of dominance and consistency at a high level. And he went further. He pointed out that there are solid metrics, such as FPI and schedule strength, where Alabama appears at or near the top, surpassing programs that haven't even had to face the weekly wear and tear of an SEC schedule. For DeBoer, there is no arrogance in stating that Alabama is one of the best teams in the country. There is conviction based on performance. There are numbers, tape, production, and visible evolution. For him, and for a large part of the college football community, competing in the SEC championship game should never be interpreted as a risk, but as a merit. Alabama didn't reach this stage by chance. It overcame adversity, corrected mistakes, adjusted its offense under pressure, and returned to being a team that responds on the field when the temperature rises. Feinbaum, of course, sees this from another angle. In his view, denying Alabama the right to advance would be more than a technical error. It would be an affront to the sport. He argues that removing a giant with this level of competitiveness would set a dangerous precedent, that playing the conference finals is worth less than simply avoiding it. And if this becomes the norm, he warns, then the finals would lose their meaning and the integrity of the format would be officially compromised. Ultimately, Feinbaum's indignation and DeBoer's focused stance converge on the same idea. Alabama has done enough. It built a track record, won difficult games, faced hostile stadiums, defeated major rivals, and positioned itself with authority among the elite teams of the season. The committee can discuss, speculate, and analyze scenarios, but everything converges on the same conclusion. This Alabama team is not only competitive, it's resilient, disciplined, and capable of taking on any program in the country. And if the goal of the playoffs is to bring together the best teams, as DeBoer made clear, then excluding the Crimson Tide would be more than a controversy. It would be a sporting injustice. Let's move on. The penultimate playoff rankings released brought a boost to Crimson Tide fans. The team moved up one position and now ranks 9th nationally. With only the SEC championship remaining on the calendar, many are already speculating that Alabama has a guaranteed playoff spot. But, as ESPN's Heather Dinnick reminded us, it's best not to celebrate victory prematurely. After all, in college football, nothing is as simple as it seems. Alabama's situation is peculiar, to say the least. They have already faced and defeated Georgia this season, which theoretically gives them a psychological advantage, as well as a solid argument should they suffer a defeat in the decisive matchup. However, Dinnick warned that the unfolding of the game will be crucial. If Georgia repeats the massacre they inflicted on Texas, for example, it could cause the committee to reassess Alabama's strength. This is because, as she explained, the committee watches the games together and then votes. A balanced game, even with a loss, likely guarantees Alabama a playoff spot. A blowout? Well, that's another story. Kalen DeBoer, the coach who took over the program during a transitional phase, has been cautiously managing expectations. He knows Alabama's legacy is built on winning big games, especially against rivals like Georgia. And while the team has fluctuated throughout the season, with 2 losses on the record, it has also shown enough resilience to remain in the playoff conversation. Now, with the season reaching its climax, the moment is crucial, not only to secure a playoff spot, but to reaffirm the identity of a program accustomed to being at the top. Tim Keenan, Alabama's defensive lineman, was direct when speaking about the team's approach to this matchup. "We're a 10-2 SEC team," he said. "We go out there and play with grit. Of course, it's the SEC championship. It's a big game. We've beaten this team before." Their message is clear. Alabama doesn't want to depend on the committee's benevolence. They want to resolve this on the field with the characteristic Tuscaloosa style. This mentality reflects the spirit of the program, which has always prioritized controlling its own destiny. But what makes this situation even more interesting is the larger context of college football. If the published ranking were definitive, all the teams in the top 10 would be qualified for the playoffs, including Notre Dame, which occupies the 10th position. Furthermore, there are other possible scenarios, such as the inclusion of BYU if it beats Texas Tech and wins the Big 12 title. This means that, even with its privileged position, Alabama cannot be careless. In a sport where every detail counts, the unfolding of the game against Georgia will be closely watched by the committee. And here lies the great dilemma for Alabama. They have already proven their worth by defeating Georgia earlier this season, but that's no guarantee of anything. College football is unforgiving, and the committee tends to be influenced by recent performances. A narrow defeat could easily be justified by the history of the matchup, but a poor performance would be seen as a sign of weakness. And in a system where perception matters as much as results, that could be costly. What is evident is that Alabama is in a privileged position, but not immune to errors. They have room for stumbles, but not for collapse. Kalen DeBoer needs to keep the team focused, especially at a time when external pressures are enormous. The players know they're being watched not only by the committee, but by the entire college football community. Every play, every tactical decision will be meticulously analyzed. Now, it remains to be seen if they will be able to do what is necessary to secure their playoff spot without depending on others. As Tim Keenan said, the goal is to take care of their own business. And if there's one thing Alabama knows how to do well, it's exactly that: control what is within their reach and leave the rest for others to decide. What's your opinion? Comment